If you sign that contract tonight, sir, you won't own your company by Christmas. The words were quiet, calm, almost drowned beneath the soft clink of crystal glasses and the low jazz drifting through Blackwood Reserve, Manhattan's most exclusive private dining restaurant. But they were enough to make Ethan Blackwell slowly lift his eyes from the contract in front of him. The billionaire CEO had spent 20 years building Blackwell Energy into one of the fastest-growing clean tech companies in America. He had negotiated with oil ministers in Dubai, argued with senators in Washington, and survived hostile takeovers on Wall Street. Yet somehow, the voice that interrupted his $480 million German acquisition belonged to a waitress carrying sparkling water. For a moment, nobody moved. The German investors exchanged confused glances, while the translator beside Ethan adjusted his tie with a nervous smile. Naomi Carter stood beside the table in her fitted black uniform, one hand wrapped around the silver tray she carried. Her expression remained composed, but her dark eyes never left the papers in front of Ethan. "Excuse me," Ethan finally said, his voice low and dangerous. Around them, the private dining room glowed beneath golden chandelier light. Rain slid slowly down the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. The city shimmered outside like cold gold. Naomi swallowed carefully. "The translator changed one word in German," she said softly. "One word that transfers controlling interest after the second quarter." Silence. Heavy. Immediate. Ethan's attorney frowned. "That's impossible." The translator laughed too quickly. "Sir, with respect, she's a server. She probably misunderstood conversational German." Naomi turned toward him slowly. Then she answered in flawless German. "Fast." Precise. Cold enough to cut through the room like broken glass. The smiles vanished from the investors' faces almost instantly. One of them muttered something under his breath. Another reached for the contract. Ethan felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. Not fear. Instinct. The kind that told powerful men when the room had suddenly changed. His gray eyes locked onto Naomi. Again. She no longer looked invisible. She no longer looked like part of the restaurant furniture people ignored between courses. She looked dangerous. Calmly dangerous. The translator's forehead began to shine beneath the chandelier lights. "Who are you?" Ethan asked quietly. Naomi hesitated for half a second. Then she lowered her tray onto the edge of the table with careful hands. "Just a waitress," she said. But the way the German investors stared at her told Ethan Blackwell that was the first lie spoken all night. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. The rain outside grew heavier, sliding across the glass walls of the private dining room, while the pianist downstairs continued playing soft jazz like nothing had happened. Ethan Blackwell leaned back slowly in his chair, his expensive Swiss watch catching the chandelier light as his eyes stayed fixed on Naomi Carter. The German investors no longer looked confident. One of them whispered sharply toward the translator in rapid German. Another closed the contract folder entirely. The atmosphere had shifted. Completely. Ethan noticed it immediately because men like him survived by sensing weakness before it appeared in headlines. "Translate what he just said," Ethan ordered calmly, looking directly at Naomi instead of the translator. Naomi hesitated, not from fear, more like exhaustion, as though she already understood how dangerous truth could become once spoken aloud. Then she answered quietly. He asked why the translator changed the ownership clause without their approval. The translator's face lost color. "That is not accurate," he interrupted quickly. "This woman is trying to confuse everyone." Naomi finally looked at him fully. Her voice stayed soft. "You replaced the word partnership with authority transfer." One of the German executives suddenly slammed his palm lightly against the table and spoke sharply in German. Even Ethan, who did not understand the language, recognized anger when he heard it. The translator opened his mouth, but no words came out this time. Ethan's attorney quickly grabbed the contract and flipped through the pages with growing concern. "She is right," he said under his breath. Section 14 changes voting control after 2 fiscal quarters. Silence again. Heavy silence. The kind that made expensive rooms feel small. Ethan slowly stood from his chair. 6'2". tailored charcoal suit, the type of presence that usually controlled every room without effort. But tonight his attention remained on the quiet waitress beside the wine cart. Naomi looked strangely detached from the chaos around her, almost as if she had already learned long ago that powerful men only notice people like her when disaster arrived first. "Where did you learn German like that?" Ethan asked. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "Howard University," she replied. "International business and language studies." Ethan frowned slightly. "And now you work here?" A faint smile crossed Naomi's face, but it carried no warmth. "Life does not always care about degrees, Mr. Blackwell." Somewhere downstairs, glasses clinked softly. A waiter laughed. Manhattan continued breathing beyond the rain-covered windows. But inside that private room, Ethan Blackwell could not stop staring at the woman who had just saved him hundreds of millions of dollars while carrying a tray of sparkling water. Ethan Blackwell canceled the signing dinner 15 minutes later. No dramatica non cement. No raised voice. He simply closed the contract folder, adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit, and told his legal team to postpone all negotiations until morning. The German executives left quietly after that, avoiding eye contact with the translator who now sat alone at the far end of the polished oak table, staring at his untouched glass of wine. Naomi Carter collected empty plates in silence. Calm, efficient, like none of it had happened. But Ethan kept watching her. He noticed the details now. The way she moved through the room without wasted motion. The way other servers naturally stepped aside when she passed. Even her posture felt different from everyone else in the restaurant. Too composed. Too controlled. Most people became nervous around billionaires. Naomi looked tired of them. "Mr. Blackwell?" his attorney asked carefully once the room emptied. "Should I contact federal counsel regarding the contract fraud?" Ethan barely heard him. His eyes remained on Naomi as she folded a linen napkin near the service station beneath the warm amber lights. "Not yet," he replied quietly. "First I want to know why a waitress understands international acquisition law better than my translator." Downstairs, the restaurant buzzed with low conversation and soft piano music. Wealthy couples laughed over lobster risotto and 30-year scotch while rain continued pouring across Manhattan. But inside Ethan's mind, something felt unsettled. Men like him built entire empires by reading people quickly. Investors, politicians, competitors. Yet somehow he had completely failed to notice the smartest person in the room until she interrupted him. Naomi turned slightly when she sensed him approaching. Up close, Ethan noticed faint exhaustion beneath her eyes. Not weakness, the kind of exhaustion people carried when life forced them to become practical too early. "You embarrassed my entire executive team tonight," Ethan said. Naomi blinked once. "I was trying to save your company." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Most people would have stayed quiet. Most people do. Her answer came immediately. A server passed beside them carrying champagne flutes. Naomi stepped aside automatically to make room before continuing to wipe down the table with slow, careful movements. Ethan noticed her hands. Elegant hands. Steady hands. Not the hands he expected from someone working double shifts carrying heavy trays across polished marble floors. "Howard University is not cheap," he said after a moment. "No. So what happened?" Naomi folded the cloth neatly before answering. "Hospital bills happened." Ethan said nothing. She finally looked up at him then, and for the first time all evening, he saw emotion break through her calm expression. Just for a second. "My mother got sick during my final year," she said softly. After that, survival became more important than ambition. The words landed harder than Ethan expected. Survival. Men in his world rarely used words like that anymore. They spoke about market shares and quarterly projections while forgetting there were people outside. Boardrooms measuring life month to month. Ethan glanced toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Park Avenue. "You could have worked anywhere," he said quietly. "Why here?" Naomi gave a faint, tired smile. "Because rich men tip well when they think you are invisible." Ethan froze slightly at the honesty in her voice. "No bitternis. No self-pity, just truth. Simple and sharp. Somewhere behind them, the restaurant manager suddenly rushed toward Naomi looking pale. "Naomi," he whispered urgently, "there are 2 men downstairs asking for you." Naomi's expression changed instantly. Not fear exactly. Recognition. And for the first time that night, Ethan Blackwell realized the woman who saved his company might be hiding something far bigger than a college degree. Naomi's fingers tightened slightly around the linen cloth before she folded it one final time and placed it carefully beside the empty wine glasses. The restaurant manager stood awkwardly near her shoulder, clearly uncomfortable. "They have been asking for you for almost 20 minutes, he whispered nervously. "I told them you were busy." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Just 1 second. Then she nodded once. Calm again. "Thank you, Daniel." Ethan watched the exchange carefully. Something had shifted in her expression the moment she heard those men were downstairs. Until now, Naomi had carried herself with quiet control, the kind that came from intelligence and restraint. But this felt different. Personal. "Is there a problem?" Ethan asked. Naomi immediately straightened. "No, sir." The answer came too quickly. Ethan noticed that too. Rain hammered softly against the windows overlooking Manhattan, while the restaurant lights reflected across the wet streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren echoed through the city before fading into the night. Naomi picked up her tray again. "I should get back to work." Ethan stepped slightly into her path without thinking. Not aggressive. Just enough to stop her from disappearing into the restaurant crowd. "You saved me $500 million tonight," he said quietly. "You do not owe me politeness. If something is wrong, say it." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Her dark eyes studied him carefully, almost like she was deciding whether powerful men could ever truly hear honesty without trying to own it afterward. Then she gave the smallest shake of her head. "Some problems do not improve because rich people get involved." The sentence hit harder than Ethan expected. Before he could answer, 2 men appeared near the staircase leading into the private dining level. Expensive coats. Mid-40s. Wall Street energy. One of them spotted Naomi immediately. "There she is," he said sharply. Naomi's entire body went still. Ethan noticed the change instantly. Not fear. More like disappointment. Like someone reopening an old wound she thought had finally healed. The taller man approached first, loosening his cashmere scarf as he glanced around the luxury dining room. "You disappeared without answering calls again," he said coldly. "That was not smart." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Gentlemen," he interrupted smoothly, "this floor is private." The men barely looked at him. Their attention stayed fixed on Naomi. "You should have told him who you really are," the second man said with a humorless smile. Naomi's jaw tightened. "Leave. Not until we talk." Ethan crossed his arms slowly. "I believe the lady already answered." The taller man finally looked Ethan up and down, recognition flashing across his face. "Blackwell," he said quietly. "Interesting." Naomi immediately stepped forward. "Do not do this here." Her voice stayed calm, but Ethan noticed the subtle tremor beneath it for the first time all night. The second man reached inside his coat pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He placed it gently onto the white tablecloth beside Ethan's untouched espresso cup. Ethan glanced down. The article was 5 years old. The headline read, "Howard University prodigy accused in $20 million financial leak." Beneath the headline was a younger photo of Naomi Carter. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward her. The room felt colder now, quieter. Naomi stared at the newspaper clipping without touching it. Then she whispered something so softly only Ethan could hear it. "I told you survival mattered more than ambition." The newspaper clipping rested beside Ethan Blackwell's espresso cup like a ghost dragged out of the past. Nobody touched it. The soft jazz downstairs suddenly felt too distant now, almost unreal against the heavy silence hanging over the private dining room. Ethan picked up the article slowly. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges from age, but the headline remained sharp enough to cut through the room. Howard University prodigy accused in $20 million financial leak. Beneath it, Naomi Carter looked younger, softer somehow. She wore a graduation blazer in the photograph, standing beside a university podium with a scholarship medal around her neck. Ethan glanced back up at the woman standing in front of him, now carrying a silver serving tray beneath chandelier lights. The contrast unsettled him more than he expected. "You never told him the best part," Naomi said quietly to the two men. Her voice had gone strangely calm again. Too calm. The taller man slipped his hands into the pockets of his wool coat. "You disappeared after the investigation," he replied. "People were curious. People were looking for someone to blame," Naomi corrected softly. Ethan folded the article carefully. "What investigation?" he asked. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked toward the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. Far below, headlights moved through the wet streets like rivers of gold. For a moment, she looked very small against the city skyline. "5 years ago," she said quietly, "I worked as a junior financial analyst while finishing graduate school." Ethan listened without interrupting. "One night, I discovered irregular offshore transfers linked to a private investment firm. Millions of dollars moving through fake international partnerships." The second man laughed softly. "You make yourself sound heroic." Naomi ignored him. "I reported it internally." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. He already knew how stories like this usually ended. Naomi continued staring out at the storm. 3 days later, someone leaked confidential financial files to the press. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray. "Suddenly I became the easiest person to blame." Ethan looked down at the article again. The wording felt familiar now. Brilliant student. Security breach. Suspicious access logs. Career destroyed overnight. Wall Street loved stories like that, especially when the accused lacked money powerful enough to fight back. The charges were dropped, Ethan noticed quietly. "Lack of evidence," Naomi replied. But by then it did not matter anymore. One of the men stepped closer. "You cost people millions of dollars, Naomi." She finally turned toward him, and Ethan noticed something change in her eyes. Not weakness, not shame, just exhaustion from repeating the truth to people who preferred profitable lies. "No," she said softly. "I threatened people who were already stealing millions." Silence again. Ethan felt it immediately this time. The subtle shift beneath the conversation. The feeling that everyone in the room was circling around something bigger than an old scandal. Then the taller man smiled coldly toward Ethan. "You should ask her who owned the investment firm." Naomi's face lost color for the first time all night. Ethan noticed that too. Slowly, carefully, he lowered the newspaper clipping onto the table. "Who?" he asked. The man's smile widened slightly. "Blackwell Capital." The rain outside seemed louder suddenly. Ethan stood completely still. Because Blackwell Capital had belonged to his father before Ethan inherited the company 8 years earlier. And judging by the look in Naomi Carter's eyes, she had known that from the moment she first heard his name. Ethan Blackwell did not speak for several seconds. The name of his father's company lingered in the private dining room heavier than the storm outside. Blackwell Capital. The empire his father built before Ethan transformed it into Blackwell Energy after the old scandals quietly disappeared from financial headlines years ago. Ethan slowly loosened the knot of his tie, his gray eyes never leaving Naomi Carter. Suddenly pieces began falling into place inside his mind with terrifying precision. The moment she recognized his name earlier, the hesitation in her voice, the exhaustion behind her calm expression. She had known exactly who he was from the beginning. "You worked for my father," Ethan said quietly. Naomi nodded once. Briefly, the taller man gave a dry laugh. "She was more than an employee. Your father called her the smartest analyst in the building before everything collapsed." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. His father rarely praised anyone, especially not young employees. Naomi looked down at the untouched espresso cup beside the newspaper clipping. "Your father trusted me," she said softly. At first, something about those last 2 words unsettled Ethan more than anger would have. Across the room, Daniel, the restaurant manager, pretended to organize wine menus while clearly listening to every word. Even the servers passing nearby had grown quieter now, sensing tension beneath the polished luxury atmosphere. "You are saying my father framed you?" Ethan asked carefully. Naomi immediately shook her head.
No isen frowned.
"Then what are you saying?" Naomi finally met his eyes fully. "I am saying your father was already dying when the leak happened." Ethan froze. Very few people outside the family knew how sick Richard Blackwell had been during his final years running the company. "The board panicked," Naomi continued softly. "Executives were hiding money overseas before leadership changed." One of the men stepped closer. "Careful, Naomi." But she ignored him now. Years of silence seemed to be cracking open beneath the chandelier lights. "I found the transfers accidentally while auditing energy acquisitions in Frankfurt," she said. "I reported everything directly to Richard Blackwell because I thought honesty still mattered inside that company." Ethan felt something cold settle in his chest. "And," Naomi gave a faint, humorless smile. "And 3 days later, security escorted me out of the building while reporters waited outside. Rain streaked across the windows behind her like silver lines. Manhattan glittered below them, beautiful and indifferent." Ethan remembered that year clearly now. His father barely able to stand during board meetings. Investors circling like sharks. Executives fighting quietly for control before the old man even died. Back then Ethan had been too busy, trying to save the company, to notice the name of one junior analyst buried inside legal reports. "You never fought the accusations publicly," Ethan said. Naomi's expression softened slightly, but not with warmth. "My mother needed surgery," she answered. "Lawyers cost money I did not have." Silence. Ethan suddenly understood something uncomfortable then. Naomi had not disappeared because she was guilty. She disappeared because survival left no room for pride. The taller man adjusted his coat impatiently. "This conversation is becoming dangerous." Ethan looked at him sharply. "Dangerous for who?" The man smiled thinly. "For everyone connected to the old accounts." Naomi immediately stepped forward. "Stop." Her voice remained quiet, but this time Ethan heard fear underneath it. Real fear. "You do not understand what you are pulling apart." Ethan stared at her carefully. "Then help me understand." Naomi closed her eyes briefly before whispering the words that changed the room all over again. "The offshore accounts are still active." The private dining room suddenly felt too small for the truth Naomi Carter had just spoken. Ethan Blackwell stared at her across the polished oak table while rain continued sliding down the glass walls behind them. "The offshore accounts are still active." The words echoed inside his head louder than the storm outside. Ethan slowly removed his watch and placed it beside the untouched espresso cup, a habit he had whenever he needed to think clearly. Across from him, the two men exchanged uneasy glances. For the first time since arriving, their confidence looked fragile. "That is enough," the taller man said sharply. "You should leave this alone, Blackwell." Ethan ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Naomi. "How do you know the accounts are still active?" Naomi hesitated. Ethan noticed her fingers tighten slightly around the serving tray again. Small detail. But men who built billion-dollar companies survived by noticing small details. "Because somebody accessed one of the Frankfurt holding accounts 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "How would you even see that?" Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. "I still monitor them." Silence. Even the two men looked shocked by that answer. Ethan leaned forward slowly. "You have been tracking offshore accounts connected to my father's company for 5 years? Naomi nodded once. "Not for your father." Her voice softened. "For the employees who disappeared after the investigation." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Disappeared?" The shorter man laughed nervously. "She always talks like everything is some conspiracy." Naomi turned toward him calmly. 3 accountants lost their careers within 6 months. One relocated overseas overnight. Another settled with federal investigators and vanished from public records completely. Her dark eyes shifted back toward Ethan. And every time the accounts moved money, the same names appeared around the transactions. Ethan felt the room grow colder beneath the chandelier lights. His father had always warned him that power attracted parasites. But Ethan suddenly realized something worse. Sometimes the parasites never left. "Who still controls the accounts?" he asked quietly. Naomi looked toward the two men standing near the staircase. Neither answered. That silence told Ethan everything. The taller man adjusted his coat again. "You are stepping into old business that does not concern you anymore." Ethan almost smiled at that. Coldly. "If my company is connected to criminal offshore accounts, it concerns me." "Your company survived because people made difficult choices," the man replied carefully. Naomi's voice cut through the tension before Ethan could answer. "No," she said softly. "His company survived because innocent people became disposable." The room fell silent again. Ethan looked at her differently now. Earlier tonight she had seemed intelligent, impressive, unexpected. But this was something deeper. Naomi Carter had spent 5 years carrying the weight of a truth nobody powerful wanted spoken aloud. Alone, quietly, while serving wine to wealthy strangers who never bothered learning her name. Ethan suddenly understood why she looked exhausted long before tonight began. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Naomi looked out toward the storm-covered skyline again. "Because tonight they tried to steal your company the same way they stole your father's." Ethan froze slightly at that sentence. The two men immediately stiffened. "Careful," the taller one warned. Naomi ignored him completely. "The German acquisition was never about energy expansion," she continued softly. "It was about moving controlling assets offshore before the federal audit next quarter." Ethan's pulse slowed instead of rising. Dangerous calm. The kind his executives feared most during negotiations. "And the translator?" Naomi finally looked back at him. "He works for them." Downstairs, someone laughed near the piano bar. Glasses clinked softly. Manhattan continued glowing beneath the rain like the city had not just shifted beneath Ethan Blackwell's feet forever. Ethan Blackwell picked up his phone without another word. The movement alone changed the energy inside the private dining room. Men who spent years around power recognized dangerous silence when they heard it. One of the executives near the staircase immediately stepped forward. "You do not want to make that call tonight." Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward him. Calm. Ice cold. "Watch me." Naomi stepped in before the situation could spiral further. "Ethan." It was the first time she had used his first name. Quiet. Careful. Somehow more powerful than shouting would have been. Ethan paused. Naomi set the silver tray onto the table beside the folded newspaper clipping. "If federal investigators appear now, every executive tied to those accounts will erase what is left before sunrise." Ethan stared at her for a long moment. "Then what do you suggest?" Naomi hesitated. Rain continued falling behind her in silver streams across the Manhattan skyline, while jazz music drifted faintly from downstairs. "There is one account they cannot close quickly," she said softly. "Frankfurt National Reserve." The taller man's face immediately darkened. Ethan noticed that reaction instantly. Naomi continued before anyone could interrupt. "Your father created it as an emergency holding account before his illness became public. Nobody touched it for years because accessing it requires 2 original authorization signatures." Ethan frowned. Slightly. "My father is dead." Naomi nodded once. "Which means only one authorized signature remains active." Ethan's expression slowly changed. "Mine." Naomi looked at him carefully. "They thought you never knew the account existed." Silence. Heavy silence. Ethan suddenly understood everything at once. The German acquisition, the manipulated contract, the translator, the offshore movements. This was never random corruption. It was a cleanup operation before he accidentally discovered what his father's board had hidden for years. Ethan looked toward the two men standing near the staircase. "You were trying to move the last accounts before the audit." Neither answered. That silence confirmed it better than words could. Naomi reached into the pocket of her black serving apron and carefully removed a small folded piece of paper. worn edges, creased from years of being carried. Ethan frowned as she placed it gently beside his watch. "What is this?" Naomi's voice softened almost to a whisper. "The account number your father gave me the night before I was escorted out of Blackwell Capital." Ethan stared at the paper without touching it. "Why would he give it to you?" Naomi looked down briefly. Pain flickered across her face before disappearing again beneath control. "Because he realized too late who around him was stealing." One of the men suddenly stepped forward. "Do not be naive, Blackwell. Your father protected the company the only way he could." Ethan's eyes hardened instantly. "By destroying innocent people?" The man said nothing. Naomi slowly stepped back toward the windows again, exhaustion visible beneath the warm chandelier lights. "Your father told me something that night," she said quietly. Ethan looked toward her. "What?" Naomi's dark eyes met his across the silent room. "He said power does not ruin people." A pause. Soft. Heavy. "It only reveals who they already were." By midnight, the private dining room at Blackwood Reserve stood almost empty. The chandeliers still glowed softly above the polished tables, but the energy had changed completely. The German investors were gone. The translator had disappeared without saying goodbye. Even the two executives, connected to the offshore accounts, had quietly left after Ethan Blackwell informed them his legal team would begin a full internal audit before sunrise. Now only Ethan and Naomi remained near the rain-covered windows overlooking Manhattan. The storm had finally started slowing down. Water still shimmered across Park Avenue below, reflecting gold and silver beneath the city lights. Naomi stood beside the service station, removing wine glasses from a tray one by one with slow, careful movements. Calm again, quiet again, as though she preferred disappearing back into ordinary life now that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. Ethan watched her for a long moment before speaking. "You could have destroyed my company tonight." Naomi gave a faint, tired smile without looking up. "No," she gently folded a linen napkin between her hands. "I saved it." Ethan almost laughed at the honesty in her voice. Instead, he walked toward the table where the folded account number still rested beside his watch. 5 years, he said quietly. "You carried all of this alone for 5 years." Naomi finally looked at him then. Her dark eyes reflected the warm chandelier light softly. "People like me do not usually get the luxury of falling apart." The sentence settled heavily between them. Ethan thought about everything he had missed before tonight. The woman serving sparkling water while wealthy executives ignored her existence. The intelligence hidden beneath exhaustion. The dignity hidden beneath survival. He had spent years believing power belonged to the loudest person in the room. Tonight proved otherwise. Ethan picked up the folded paper slowly before slipping it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. "Tomorrow morning," he said carefully, "federal investigators will receive every file connected to those accounts." Naomi lowered her eyes slightly. Not relieved, just tired. "A lot of important people will hate you for that." Ethan stepped closer to the windows beside her. "Then they should have been smarter." For the first time all evening, Naomi laughed quietly. Soft, genuine. The sound surprised both of them. Downstairs, the pianist began playing something slower now while restaurant staff prepared to close for the night. Ethan loosened his tie completely and glanced toward Naomi again. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "my board spent 6 months searching for the anonymous analyst who warned us about the European energy collapse last year." Naomi froze slightly beside him. Ethan noticed immediately. "The report came from a private encrypted account," he continued. "It saved Blackwell Energy nearly $200 million. Naomi looked back out at the city skyline instead of answering. Ethan smiled faintly then, finally understanding. "That was you too." Naomi said nothing. She did not need to. Silence sometimes carried more truth than words ever could. Outside, Manhattan glowed beneath the fading rain while inside the nearly empty restaurant. Ethan Blackwell realized the most powerful person he had met in years had been wearing a Waitress uniform all along.